It's our artists. Majority of South African artists perform on the continent, and many of them are seeing their gigs being cancelled. We can't lie about it. The backlash, and that's why part of the work that we are doing is engagement with businesses abroad, South African companies abroad. Minister Lamula has met with them, and we're providing services, support services and consular services for those businesses on the continent and outside the continent.
All right, my people, the Minister of Justice in South Africa is saying that their artists are being cancelled around the continent, and not only that, South African businesses across the continent too are facing backlash. You know, for years, many people assumed that hostility towards fellow Africans would come without consequences. Today, that assumption is being challenged. South Africa is beginning to experience the economic and social effects of growing anti-migrant sentiment. And even the government officials are acknowledging the damage. According to the Justice Minister, Mmaloko Kubayi, the impact is no longer theoretical, it is already being felt. South Africans, businesses operating across Africa are facing increasingly difficulties, while local artists who rely on performances throughout the continent are seeing their opportunities disappear. Yes.
Can artists perform on the continent, and many of them are seeing their gigs being cancelled. So that's another impact of the work, because they benefit quite a lot. They perform on live performance events and everything. So they are receiving a thing. We've not been able to work together. So we'll definitely work together with arts and culture to understand the impact for them to get. But one artist did reach out to me to say all her gigs were cancelled on the continent. She was meant. This is an income lost by a South African. So the brand does get affected. And that's why part of what we are doing is to explain that South Africans are not xenophobic. South Africans are not calling, and we are also saying to South Africans, let's be responsible. And that's why let's deal with the issue of illegal immigrants. And that's why all the others are saying to us, South Africa, we understand what you are dealing with on the basis that these are illegal people, therefore enforce the law. And those that you have within the borders legally, please protect them like you protect South Africans. So that's the message as well that we continue to do. Hence, we are calling for vigilantism to be rejected by our communities, for attacks on foreign nationals.
Impact of these protests on South African business operations in other African countries, as well as its impact on the local tourism sector. Joined now by author and commentator on African business matters, based at the University of Limpopo, Victor Khomuyaswana. Good evening to you, Victor, and thank you for your time. So depending on which side of the fence you sit, we are either in this country in the midst of a long overdue reckoning with uncontrolled illegal migration forced on by spirited protests by various civil society organizations, or we are witnessing an upsurge and a resurgence of anti-foreigner and perhaps Afrophobic, if not xenophobic as well, sentiment, or perhaps we're dealing with a bit of both. But how does the message, and how important is it, how the message lands in other jurisdictions where South Africans are present, including juristic persons who trade as businesses in other African markets?
Good evening, Tulas. You captured it very well, and I'll just skip the commentary about whether it's Afrophobia or this. But what I'll say is we left this big gap in law enforcement, and when you create a vacuum, somebody is going to take charge of that. But when it comes to businesses, already I'm seeing reports of companies like MTN, companies like Goldfields, are being affected. I wouldn't say targeted, but they're facing some kind of backlash. And you see, the problem, Tulas, is when you talk of a company like MTN, if it's not able to operate in Nigeria, it's going to be less than half the size it is, both in terms of revenue, both in terms of subscriber base, and in terms of the profit they make, because Nigeria is the golden, is the jewel in the crown of the African business. There has definitely been that kind of backlash. But if we talk about tourism as well, you have a company like Airlink, a South African private airline, which flies to more than 10 destinations on the African continent. That is definitely going to be affected by this. And lastly, if you look at the tourism, international tourism arrivals or tourist arrivals, in other words, people who land in South Africa by road or by air, 70% plus of those tourists come from the rest of the continent. And although they make less revenue for South Africa from the tourism perspective, the visitors tend to stay longer in South Africa, and they tend to spend more with the smaller and medium enterprises, which is good for the kind of economic growth and activity we need in this country. So from that perspective, I can certainly say whatever is happening in South Africa right now is not favorable or conducive to the trade relations or the business diplomacy or economic diplomacy of South Africa on the rest of the continent.
So in a way, it becomes a diplomatic exercise for these companies, doesn't it? I see, for instance, in the reporting of MoneyWeb, Ebenezer Asante, MTN's Senior Vice President for Markets, being deployed to Ghana to engage with the foreign minister there, but also MTN getting stuck in the resettlement processes of the Nigerian nationals who were repatriated from this country not so long ago.
That's the problem. In fact, let me just say this. My little experience doing business on the continent is that you become an economic diplomat. You might know your skill. If you are a legal expert, if you are a technical expert, communications expert, one thing you need over and above your technical expertise is the ability to relate as a diplomat. And that's why a company like MTN would have deployed senior leadership. I even think they're going to deploy more senior than that, because when it reaches this level where it's one country against the other, and we might look at the Bafana game and think it's just soccer. It is not. Sentiment, business, politics, all those things cannot be separated. So you're right. It becomes an economic diplomatic nightmare when you have such incidents happening, irrespective of whether you are right or wrong, Tulas.
And where are the pressure points in terms of, where those governments feel aggrieved by some of what's happening in this country, and perhaps the actions or inactions of our own government? What levers do they have? What pressure points are there in the form of licensing, the license to operate, as well as the regulatory environment?
Well, you mentioned it. There's licensing. MTN had a very huge, drawn-out standoff with the government of Nigeria, the governments of Kenya, and the governments of Ghana because of licensing. Remember, if you are operating by license, per license, you are at the mercy of the regulatory authorities. And if you recall, maybe I should say 10 years ago, MTN just used to face what we thought was targeting, undue targeting. And it would be a matter of, okay, you know what, we looked at your results from last year and we realized you didn't declare this income or that revenue, and as a result, you owe us billions of dollars in tax. You see, that is a lever that they have, because remember, it's a regulatory authority that allows you to operate. Is this another regulatory authority that receives and examines or approves your financial reports, and is the same government that is able to decide whether they renew your license or not. And even, this, they could even just revoke it in the middle of nowhere. So it's a real lever that they have, that they allow the companies to operate. The other point, Tulas, is the gateway, the ports of entry. When you land in a country, that's why I mentioned Airlink. When you land in a country, you are subject to the air traffic control or navigation control of the country where you land. The permission to just land your plane is something that's regulated. And if the government running the country where you're trying to land is hostile or is trying to react to what they consider hostility on your part, they can just deny you landing rights. And that can cause a lot of spin-offs, ripple effects, because often every plane that lands in one country is related to other flights that are moving on to several other destinations. So you could talk about entry points, you could talk about way bridges, points of control like border gates, and of course those regulatory frameworks that allow us to operate in other countries.
It's worth mentioning that it may not be directly linked to the current protests, but for Goldfields, that's actually an active conversation in Ghana as we speak at the moment about the issue of licensing. But again, important to emphasize that this apparently was a conversation that had long started before these protests happened. So someone watching then, Victor, may say, so what? What is the so what of it all? What should be then the attitude of the South African state vis-a-vis the protests that are happening in the country and how it's responding to them, and the kind of diplomacy that then needs to happen on the side of the South African state, but also for ordinary South Africans watching and saying, okay, we hear you, we understand these actions may not be taken by these companies or the state, but by activists in the country and other people in the country, but have consequences, lived consequences. But why does it matter?
It matters because the real reason South Africans who are in March and all these other protests are taking the actions they are taking, the real reason is the vacuum created by poor regulatory system and poor law enforcement. If I'm hungry, Tulas, I'm in my house and my neighbor breaks in, I am hungry, I'm not going to be very hospitable. So you cannot blame an unemployed person for being hostile, but you can blame a government that has got the levers, the powers, the border management authorities, the police, the army, that is failing to enforce its own immigration and customs regulations. That is where we must start. Ensure that everybody who's in the country is documented correctly. But if we are to act against illegal immigration, let's do it in a humane possible. Let's not let our unemployment, our economic crisis make us hostile to fellow human beings. Because in the end, some of the actions that we take in the name of fighting illegal immigration are not humane. And I cannot see how hunger should make me that hostile towards a fellow human being. But again, I must say, I can't say that to a person who's unemployed, who believes they're unemployed because of an illegal immigrant. Lastly, even if we removed all the illegal immigrants, let's face the facts, 40% unemployment rate in South Africa, we would be dishonest if we say it is because of illegal immigrants. So it's a balanced whole scorecard kind of response, Julius. It's not one thing, but I think the government has to take action and control the illegal immigration, enforce laws better, curb corruption at the border posts and at the Home Affairs offices and its agencies, and we will start seeing a difference here. And of course, invest in those international and diplomatic relations to make sure that they communicate with the governments from where these illegal immigrants are coming, to hold them accountable, collect revenue where they are being treated in South Africa using South African taxes, and make sure that we stabilize our relations with the rest of the African continent.
All right.